we're getting a sneak peek at the Firebox 5-way Bushcraft Cooker. There's two dishes here. You can get them individually or together. There's a shallow pan underneath. There's some nice marks here that you can grill on. You can even do waffles on them because it's on both, or you can get two shallow pans. The deep pan I love with meatloaf. You get a sear on there that I can't even describe without you actually just trying it. I also did an awesome bread in here, and let me show you one of my favorite parts about this whole thing. Is I've used Dutch ovens, I've seen Pyrex glass things, but once this lid's on, that lid is on. Also, you'll see in the video that I'm using these handles. These are a prototype. The newer ones look like this, much cooler looking, and they're designed like this so you can clean after you're done. You can clean this bottom part, and then you want to get the top lip, you flip it over, and then you can scrape the top as well and get your cast iron nice and clean. Also, in the video, I used two of these to pick it up really awkwardly. Well, I've been informed there's a better way to do it. Take one handle, come in between both lids, and you can pick up the whole thing with the handle, which holds it very well. Now let's jump in on how to make the meatloaf. We want to start off by putting the deep pan in the oven on 475. Get it heating up. We want this thing hot. The reason we want to preheat that, in my opinion, is when I have a hamburger, I would much prefer a hamburger that's been seared or charbroiled than one that's just been baked. I feel like the searing adds so much more flavor. So I tried it out with this and I love it. This pan is worth its weight in gold just for the searing of the meatloaf. This meatloaf is the best meatloaf I've ever had. First thing we want to do is chop up an onion into really small pieces. So you could do this in a food processor if you have one handy. It'd probably be quicker than chopping it by hand. But I'm just gonna go through and chop it real quick. My first time making this recipe, I just kind of did like a normal chop of onion, but I feel like the big chunks broke it apart. So that's why we're chopping it so small. That is the texture we're going for, just chopped up into that small of pieces. I will tell you with 100% certainty that the food processor was significantly faster than me chopping. So, food for thought. Now that we've got our onions all chopped up, and we're going to cook them until they're nice and brown and translucent. Let's go ahead and start assembling the rest of the ingredients while our onions are cooking. First thing we're gonna do is add some meat, and all of these amounts will be in the description below. A little topic on the meat here. I have lean ground beef. I'm not promoting it because it's low fat or anything, but I've done this before with 80-20, and there was a lot of fat in the pan that I had to like pour out before I could flip it over at the end. So we're gonna try it with lean this time, hoping we won't get as much oil to have to deal with. We've got salt. We've got pepper. And I go heavy on the pepper because with my beef, I like a hit of pepper. Some sage. If you don't have sage in the kitchen, it's probably fine not to add it, but I like the flavor. And ketchup. We've got some beaten eggs. 1 sleeve of Ritz crackers. This is about 3.5 ounces. You could switch it out for any other kind of chips, potato chips, Doritos, even breadcrumbs. Do 3.5 to 4 ounces and you'll be good to go. I just keep them in the sleeve and just crack them. Our crackers are all cracked up. Garlic powder. I like to just sprinkle a little bit because we're gonna also add some chopped up garlic to our onions. Now let's go in and add our onions and cooked garlic. Now to mix. You can go in with your hands and mix. I like to just use a fork. The biggest thing is I try not to squish it and mush it all together because then you don't get nice air pockets of juices. Also, you're not getting like a dense. I don't want like a dense meatloaf, you know. Now the fun begins. We've got our hot cast iron. Be very careful with it. We're gonna take a rubber spatula and scoop this mixture in. And this is the sound you should hear when it hits it. You should hear a sizzle. If you don't hear a sizzle, there's something wrong in the world. So now just kind of lightly push it down so it's getting contact on the sides and the bottom. That's gonna help us get a nice sear and smooth out the top. We want it to be a nice uniform size so it cooks evenly. Oh, it's smelling good already. Take your bottom piece, and I would probably put it on with the handle just so you don't risk burning yourself. Back into the oven until it reaches an internal temp of 145. We are about 25 minutes into this thing. We just temped at 140. And let me tell you something we want to do real quick. Make sure you don't have a big pool of fat. So when I did this with the 80-20 ground beef, there was literally like fat up to the meat line. There was a ton of it, so I had to pour it out. I think we're okay here though. I don't see a lot of extra fat. So here's what we do now. Put the lid back on, and you'll see why it's important to get the fat out first. Flip it. You should hear a sear again, because that bottom's hot. Now what we're gonna do is take off the top. Oh yeah. Look at that. That is the sear that we're going for. Get your favorite barbecue sauce. Sweet Baby Ray's is good. Blues Hog's good. And put it on. Take a brush and brush it. Then we're gonna go back in the oven for 10 more minutes. Here's our meatloaf, straight out of the oven. Let's go ahead and temp it. This is just a Thermapen. Right at 162. So that's nice and safe to eat. And there we have it, delicious meatloaf. Let's try a bite of that nice seared meat. Now let's jump in on how to make that bread. First thing we're gonna do is go in with our warm water, like pretty warm water. All the amounts I'll put in the description below. But first thing I like to do is water and then yeast. I'll just use my finger, mix it up, just to kind of make it bloom a little bit. Add the flour. We're just using all-purpose flour. And then some table salt. We're gonna run this just long enough to get everything incorporated and mixed together. We're not gonna fully knead it because this is a long rising dough. There is our dough. So like I said, we don't mix it too long. That was going for about 3 or 4 minutes, not long at all. So let's go ahead and take a look at it now. So you can see it's a pretty wet dough. That's what we're going for, is more of a wet dough. I like to put it in a bowl, or you could do like a container like this with a lid. This is what I prefer. But today I'll just show you that you can just literally put it right into a bowl, throw some saran wrap on there. Now, let's talk about when to make this dough. Let's say you want to make this bread Friday night for dinner. I recommend making the dough Thursday night, putting it in the fridge overnight. The next morning, get it out and let it sit out till about an hour and a half before dinner. Or you could do it the morning of, like at 8 or 9 in the morning, make it and just leave it out on the counter all day. It's just gonna develop a better flavor the night before. I've pre-made some dough. This I made last night, put it in the fridge, and got it out early this morning. You are gonna wanna flour your work surface. Carefully bring it out. There's a lot of air bubbles in there. We don't wanna kill them all, but we also don't wanna leave this too airy, or it's what's called overproofed, and it's just gonna flatten when you put it in the oven. So we're gonna wanna shape it like a loaf. Okay, just like that. Take your shallow pan, go ahead and place this in the pan. We're gonna let it sit out, put some saran wrap around it, and while that's heating up, put your deeper dish in the oven on 475. We wanna get this nice and hot, while this takes about 45 minutes to an hour to rise. Okay, our dough has risen or proofed for the last hour. What you do to make sure it's ready to go in is called the poke test. We're gonna go in and poke, pull your finger out, and for me, I like it to see it come back about halfway. If you poke and it doesn't come back at all, it's overproofed, it's gonna fall flat. But if you poke and it springs back pretty quick and most of the way, it needs to proof longer. So this thing's ready to go. Before we throw it in the oven, I like to score the top. I feel like it helps it grow more in the oven. So I just score it down the middle. Take a sharp knife and do it, or a razor blade. You want just a nice line all the way across the top, like so. That's all you need. Now, our cast iron has been preheating in the oven on 475. So let's go ahead and throw that on top. And I gotta say, I'm pretty impressed with this little handle here because it gets a good grip on the cast iron. This thing's scalding hot, so I was a little worried. And then these little notches here help lock it in. So that's pretty nifty. Now let's go ahead and put this in the oven. I need two things. So with this being so heavy, you'll definitely want to get two handles to go put it in the oven. So we're gonna let that cook in the oven for 20 minutes. And if you get a pan and the deep one, you'll get a handle for both, so you won't need to worry. After it's been in there for about 20 minutes, we're gonna take the lid off and let it cook another 5 minutes. If you want that crust to be even darker, then let it go a little longer. Okay, our bread is ready. I like to put it onto a cooling rack right away, so it doesn't get, I feel like sometimes if you put it right on the cutting board, the bottom gets a little soggy, so I like to let it cool down. Let's go ahead and take a look inside our bread. I usually like to let it sit for about 15-20 minutes before I cut into it, but for the purposes of science, we're gonna go ahead and look at it. Listen to that crust. That's how I love bread. Let's look at the crumb. Look at that. Beautiful. Let's try a bite. Honestly, my favorite thing to do on this bread is just to get some nice softened butter, spread it on. You're in business. While we're on the theme of dough, let me show you some awesome pizza we can make with that same dough. I've got dough here, it's about 250 grams from that same recipe we already made. Before we put it in the pan, let's put some oil in there. That's gonna help keep it from sticking, but at the same time, it's gonna help crisp it up. Take your dough, you can see it's a very wet, loose dough, which is fine. Let's get it in. What we're gonna do is just try and push the dough out. But right now I can tell the dough's kind of cold and doesn't want to work. So what I recommend doing is just let it sit for about 10 minutes and come back, and we're gonna be able to move it a lot easier. While we're letting this rise, get the oven on 475. We wanna get it nice and hot and warmed up, ready for this pizza. Our pizza has had some time to relax. One of the first things I do is I kind of pick it up from underneath to stretch it out further. And we just want to press it out towards those corners. Okay, so that looks about right. One of the things you want to be careful is not mess around with it too much. The more you work it, the more it's going to want to shrink up. So if you're having issues with spreading it out, just leave it for another 10 minutes and come back to it. But this is just about right. So let's start off with some sauce. You can check the description below. I have the recipe for my sauce down there. We want to go on, I mean, it depends how saucy you like your pizzas. With this thicker crust, you probably want to go on a little bit thicker with the sauce. That way there's a good balance. It's not just like you're eating bread with a little sauce and cheese on it. Now with the cheese, this is just some shredded mozzarella. I like to go thick on it, and I also like to push it out towards those edges, touching that cast iron, because it crisps it up and it makes for a really good crust. Okay, you can see we got a good amount of cheese. Now you can top it with whatever you like. I'm just doing pepperoni today, keeping it simple. Now I'd say for a pan this size, you could feed 2 average adults. I have 3 young boys, and we use 2 of these, and it fed our whole family, and we actually had like a piece extra. So it's a pretty filling pizza. So our oven is up to temp. We're gonna throw this in for 7 minutes so we can check on it and rotate it. Our pizza is ready. What I like to do is transfer it over to a cooling rack, so that way the bottom doesn't get soggy. And speaking of the bottom, we're gonna kind of sacrifice the pizza here for a sec to check out the bottom. Okay, you can see that the oil helped get a little crispy. The cast iron here is like a heat sink when you put it in the oven. If it's cold and you put it in the oven, it's gonna draw energy from the oven to heat it up. But if you put it on your stove with the pizza in it and preheat it just before you get it in the oven, just enough to get the cast iron hot, you'll get a much crispier bottom than what we have here. But this is still delicious. It's still a great pizza. So let's go ahead, cut it open. The way I like to cut these is just in rows, and then down the middle. I really like the edge pieces. You can see where the cheese here that we pushed out to the side gives it that crunchy texture. Corners are my favorite. We let the pizza cook for 14 minutes altogether. Halfway through we rotated it. You can see here that this side's browned a little more, so you want to check your oven. It's cooking evenly, don't worry about it. I generally like to flip it 180 just to get a nice even cook. Overall, I've been very impressed with this cooker. The 2 things that really stand out to me, again, is the seared meatloaf. It's pretty good, isn't it? So good. And the bread. We make a lot of bread in a Dutch oven. I liked the smaller loaf, and so did my wife, because it had more crust to bread ratio, you would say. Based on the meatloaf and bread alone, I think this cooker is worth it. There's much more you can do with it. My experience trying this out was really fun. I'm gonna keep trying out other things. Do you guys have any ideas of what you wanna see cooked in here? Let me know. Okay, I think that's good.